Welcome to the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. In Season 1, I spoke with Arend Lijphart about democratic political systems. He had a number of recommendations on how Americans could improve our democracy, if that's what we wanted to do. The question, as always, remains, how would Americans do that? So I thought we should talk a little bit more about constituent powers. I also spoke with George Van Cleve on his book, Making a New American Constitution. He had a very simple proposal. Americans would form a national convention coordinating committee for the purpose of raising funds for the endeavor, establishing the rules for the election of delegates, and perhaps setting guidelines for the convention itself. Ultimately, the committee would set a date for seating a convention to deliberate on a new constitution for the United States. As Madison so succinctly put it back in 1787, after an unequivocal experience of the inefficiency of the subsisting federal government, you are called upon to deliberate on a new constitution for the United States of America. Those were weighty words back then. But there was a palpable need to reform the political system. So, given the state of our nation today, I thought it might be a good idea to have a closer look at the future of constitutional democracies. Sergio Verdugo is an assistant professor of law at the IE Law School, where he teaches constitutional law and human rights law. He is also an editor of the International Journal of Constitutional Law and the Secretary General of the International Society of Public Law. Dr. Verdugo holds a doctorate in law from the New York University School of Law and a master's degree in law from the University of California in Berkeley. He also holds a Master in Public Law from P. Universidad Católica de Chile, and I am very happy to have him here to talk about his recent publications on constituent powers and the uncertain future of constitutional democracy. Sergio, welcome to the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. It's early here, but let me say good afternoon to you in Madrid.
Thanks to you for the invitation, John. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate that you woke up early.
Sergio, constituent power, right? Constituent power is a big topic to cover. Some of the listeners may not be very familiar with the term. So you point out there are a few definitions for constituent powers. I'm interested in Thornhill's classic doctrine of constituent power. Were those, for example, used to draft the recently proposed Chilean constitution? What are those?
Yeah, so the idea of constituent power has a long political tradition. What Thornhill calls the classical version, others call it the conventional version of the constituent power. It can be traced back to Sieyès from the French Revolution. But the version we know today does not come directly from Sieyès, but from Carl Schmitt, a Nazi scholar that interpreted Sieyès, expanded his theory, and used it in, I would say, wrong ways. And that version got spread out to continental Europe and also got into Latin America. I would say that the theory of constituent power as framed by the Sieyès/Schmitt idea is probably less popular in the common locale and more popular in continental Europe and Latin America. And it possesses a fascinating discussion at the theoretical level. But what I'm interested in, even though I think these political discussions are very interesting, but what interested me is really how this idea of the constituent power is used by actual politicians engaging in constitution-making processes. And the idea is that this conventional understanding of the constituent power, as proposed by many scholars and spread out in continental Europe and Latin America, has been used using Carl Schmitt's frame, which is very dangerous and should be rejected. That's why I wrote a paper called asking the question whether it is time to abandon the constituent power idea. Mm-hmm. I was also writing about the Chilean constitution making process. You just mentioned it. During the Chilean constitution making process, there was a debate on whether the process was actually using the prescriptions made by this theory. But regardless of the fact of how we interpret the constitution making process in Chile, it is important to state from the beginning that the narrative of constituent power was used politically by part of the convention. And this created an effect. Even though we could say that the constituent power theory did not hold in the end in Chile, it was still used and it still produced a negative effect during the process.
Interesting. We're going to get into a lot of things here, in particular from the American perspective. And I think about constituent power. I think about the phrase that all Americans are familiar with, we the people.
Yeah.
We want to break that down because it's a little complicated, but it's fascinating to me nonetheless. Because in your paper, Is It Time to Abandon the Theory of Constituent Power? You write, a group of scholars has shown that the theory of constituent power, which seeks to describe and justify the dismantling of the constitutional order and its replacement for a new constitution, is flawed. So this is the main question here. Is constituent power the same thing as we the people? And if that's the case, how is it flawed?
So it's very important to distinguish the theory of popular sovereignty from the idea of constituent power. The idea of constituent power is more specific, and it has two specific purposes.
Okay.
The first purpose is to justify the enactment of a new constitution or of a constitutional replacement if you already have a constitution in place. And the second purpose is to normatively justify why that constitution should be respected for future generations. Mm-hmm. And the idea of sovereignty is broader than that, because it's not only connected to how constitutions are made. And the idea of sovereignty has different versions and different interpretations themselves. Usually American scholars dealing with the founding in the US deal directly with the idea of popular sovereignty. If you read the work of Aquilamar or Bruce Ackerman, all of these guys, they're all using directly the idea of popular sovereignty. They're not engaging precisely with the idea of the constituent power as used in Europe and Latin America, even though there are, of course, certain intellectual connections. The idea of constituent power claims the power of the people is and should be unlimited and absolute. Therefore, it cannot be constrained by previous procedures. It cannot be constrained by substantive limitations. And it should not be, right? Because the only way to liberate the people, whatever we understand the people is, or the people are, we can use it in singular or plural, should not be constrained by the previous regime. So imagine that we are in the ancient regime in France. Your agenda is to set up a new constitution to establish a republic, and you don't want the previous institutions of the ancient regime to engage with the process because according to the rules of the previous regime, the three states were not equal in the way they were voting, right? So the nobility and the clergy had the same value than the rest of the individuals. So there was no political equality. So you didn't want to have those rules constraining how to solve the crisis in France at that time. That's why Sieyès and others argue that we should have political equality, but to have political equality, we need to get rid of the previous constraints. And because the power of the people is absolute and unlimited and it cannot be constrained, therefore we're going to establish a constituent assembly not respecting the previous rules. The same you could say about the Articles of the Confederation and the Constitution in the US, right, which was enacted illegally if you consider it from the frame of idea of the Confederation. But what I argue is that these ideas that were useful for justifying and explaining revolutions at one point had important problems. Not establishing limits, constraints not having an understanding of what rights are required, what justice requires in a constitution, and using the idea of the power of the people as a mutually exclusive idea to legitimize a new constitutional order brings severe problems to the regime that we are establishing, and can be connected to populist narratives and even end up legitimizing totalitarian regimes. That's why I think that this idea should be abandoned. And I do think that we have better ways to approach the idea of legitimacy and to approach how to understand how constitutions are made.
You write, the argument suggests that if the people are to be free, then the power to resist an already established regime and replace it for a new order should not be constrained by constituted powers.
Yes.
Should there be limits on constituent powers?
There is a distinction that is important to make for the theory of constituent power. So the distinction says that on the one hand, you have the constituent power, which is the power attributed to the people, which is unlimited and absolute and cannot be and should not be constrained.
Okay.
And on the other hand, you have the constituted powers, which are the powers that are previously established. So, for example, the powers of a parliament, or of a king, or of an assembly, or of judges, right? Those are constituted powers.
Right.
Constituted powers are inherently limited because they need procedures to be established. They need rules. Without those rules, they cannot really work. But the constituent power is an unlimited power. So it's important to make the distinction. And the core idea of the constituent power theory is that constituted powers should not and cannot restrain constituent power.
Right.
So the idea of constituent power becomes an idea that operates outside the legal system and the political regime. The people operates as an external actor, right? That for Sieyès, that actor disappears after the constitution is enacted. Mm-hmm. But for Schmidt, that actor remains, right? Because that actor can decide to enact a new constitution every time that actor wants.
The constituted powers are those found in our Constitution, and the constituent powers in America refers to we the people. Is that correct?
That's correct, but you don't need a constitution to tell you that. That's the whole point of the constituent power theory, because regardless of what the formal rules say, there should be always a constituent power operating outside the regime. And that constituent power can be the people, but it can also be a dictator, right? Or can be whoever holds the power.
Or whoever takes the power.
Or whoever takes the power, exactly. And whoever takes the power will usually invoke the power of the people as a narrative to justify his or her own power, right?
Right.
What I'm saying is that the distinction between constituent power and constituted power should be rejected, because it is important to have rules. It is important to have procedures. Those rules and those procedures can set up the framework for political negotiations. So if you want to have an inclusive constitution-making process with different factions coming to the table, you need to establish procedures that are predictable and that can help to build trust. You need incentives for cross-party collaboration. So I argue that the constituent power theory and the categories that it places, even though they were useful historically, they should not be used today, because they simplify the problem of constitution making in ways that are dangerous and prone to authoritarian outcomes. This is called the paradox of constitutionalism. So the paradox posits that if you want to have a democracy, you need to have elections, you need to have voters, right? But you need to have pre-established procedures. Mm-hmm. You need to have an electoral formula, you need to have electoral institutions. So you need to have constituted powers for democracy to work.
Right.
But if you claim that constituent power is superior than constituted power and that constituted power should be constrained by whatever the constituent power claims, you are putting out there a paradox that cannot be solved, because for having the people to be organized themselves as voters and electoral procedures to happen, you need constituted powers in the first place. So the distinction is dangerous, right? Because it can end up justifying a power grab.
Yeah.
right, used retrospectively to say that whatever happened in that moment that operated outside the legal system was actually something that is legitimized afterwards with a theory that is mutually exclusive with other theories. So this theory does not invite us to think, for example, about rights or about democratic principles, but only invites us to think about how the Constitution was originated in the first place, right? So I think this posits a major problem, particularly for countries that are revising their current constitutions today.
You write, let us start with a brief description of Sayeh's thought. For him, popular sovereignty is executed through constituent power. Once the Constitution is enacted, however, constituent power disappears and only constituted powers can act, but always according to the limits that the Constitution has posited. Okay, but Washington said in his farewell address, the basis of our political system is the right of the people to make and to alter their constitutions of government. But the Constitution, which at any time exists, till changed by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people, is sacredly obligatory upon all. And then he says, the very idea of the power and the right of the people to establish government presupposes the duty of every individual to obey the established government. Does that conflict with what you're saying?
I think that an interpretation of what Washington said could be compatible with what Sayeh was saying, right? The problem is that Sayeh's version of the constituent power theory was not the one that got popularized afterwards. It was Schmidt's version. And for Schmidt's version, the constituent power never disappears. It always remains as an outsider of the political regime and can be used to desystemize that regime or to enact a new constitution at any moment. So the duty to obey the established government or to obey the established rules and the idea which reinforces the importance of constituted powers cannot be compatibilized, in my opinion, with Schmidt's idea.
We should probably talk a little bit about Schmidt. Who was he and why is he a significant person to understand?
So he was a very important legal and political philosopher. He was also a member of the Nazi Party, and many consider him to have put out their theories, legal theories, that were helpful for the Nazi agenda. For example, to justify legally the emergency powers of the rising Hitler. But he was also a very talented, I would say, and brilliant philosopher. He had a theory, he has a very important criticism against parliamentarism. Some of the most important criticisms against parliamentarism today, and democratic parliamentarism particularly, can be traced back to his ideas. He also put out there a theory explaining the nature of politics, saying that politics should be understood with a friends and enemy framework. So he wrote a lot, right? And one of his ideas, developed over many different works, was the idea of the constituent power. And with the idea of the constituent power, he was trying to assess who was basically the defender of the Constitution, who held sovereignty, and who could change the Constitution and who could interpret the Constitution. He rejected, for example, the idea that constitutional courts could exist and have the power to defend the Constitution against politicians. He rejected the idea that legislators could defend the Constitution. He placed the power on the executive branch. He thought that the executive branch was the only branch that could provide a unified version of the will of the people.
Wow.
And he connected. So his ideas are of course, can lead to a lot of authoritarian outcomes, and they cannot be tolerated today, right? And it's very important to understand the context when these ideas were discussed and framed. But, and this is a very important but, contemporary legal and constitutional theorists still use Schmidt's ideas. They use an interpretation of him, right? So they reject the authoritarian parts of his theory, and they try to understand the idea of constituent power from a democratic perspective.
Yeah.
Right. So they understand that the constituent power belongs to the people, and some of them try to reconcile it with political rights. So we cannot have constituent power if we don't have an understanding of how political rights work. So they integrate the idea of political rights, for example, into the concept of constituent power. If you open any constitutional law textbook in continental Europe and Latin America, you will identify that there is a chapter or in the introduction, but at a very early stage, discussing the idea of the constituent power, saying that constitutions are created or should be created by the people. Constituted powers should obey and follow whatever the constituent power says. Some of them will quote Schmidt, others won't. But whatever they do, despite the fact that they could or not quote him, the idea of constituent power has remained as a conventional idea in legal education. And you could see it used by judges, actually, in many of these countries. You could see judicial decisions where judges say, for example, that they cannot revise specific act because that act was enacted by the constituent power, and judges as constituted powers cannot check on them. You can also identify politicians advised by legal scholars trained with the constituent power theory, claiming that they do not need to respect rulings from courts in the past, or that they do not need to follow the rules of the constitution that is in place because they're invoking directly the constituent power of the people to enact a new constitution. This is how, for example, the constitution of Venezuela was created. And, legal theories here, they provide a legal ground or they provide arguments for this to happen. Of course, legal theories are not responsible to whatever politicians do. But I will claim that the theory that they are defending and generalizing plays a role and plays a part in these processes. In Venezuela, Chavez was elected democratically under the previous constitution. Chavez had a populist narrative in which he was blaming the former ruling elite for the problems that Venezuela had. Yep. His criticisms were well-founded. There was corruption. There was high inequality. Others were not so much. But he was using the classic textbook of populists, which is to divide the political spectrum in two, the good and the bad. You are either with the people or without the people. So after he was elected, he presented himself as a moderate, as a social democrat in the beginning. But after he was elected, he pushed for a constitutional agenda that tried to, establish a new constitution in the country. His biggest problem was that he didn't completely control the Congress, so he couldn't do everything he wanted. So he decided to call for a referendum to legitimize his plans to call for a constitution. And he designed an electoral regime to establish a constituent assembly that was going to be superior to the constituted powers. Because constituent assemblies that are founded on the basis of the constituent power theory can claim sovereignty over the other institutions. And he set up an electoral system that allowed him to control 90% of the seats of the assembly with only 60% of the votes. So the opposition didn't have any veto power during the process. He completely controlled the outcome. And he set up a process. I mean, when a judicial procedure started about, to question the legality of this process, the courts used the constituent power theory to say, this is the people speaking. This is not, so we cannot really intervene here. And eventually, Chavez got away with it. But his constituent assembly did not only enact a constitution, but also took over legislative powers that belonged to other institutions at that time. Years later, when Maduro, Chavez's successor, had the problem that he didn't have the majorities he wanted to have in the legislative assembly, in the Congress, he convoked a new constituent assembly that operated for a couple of years, starting in 2017. That assembly did not enact a new constitution. The constitution that we see today in Venezuela is still the constitution that Chavez established. But during those 2 years, Maduro used his Constituent Assembly to actually circumvent the Congress. How? Well, by invoking the Constituent Power theory, right? So you could see how, we know that populists will always use the narrative based on the people, right? So this is not unique of the Constituent Power theory. But what the Constituent Power theory brings to them is that if they can convince others that they are using the power of the people, they do not need then to respect previous institutions, right, the constituted powers in the language of the. So this provides an uncertainty during the process, and even in processes that operate under more stable conditions and more with more consensual based procedures, the language and the narrative of constituent power can be used to raise the stakes of the debates in ways that can destabilize the process at all. This happened in Chile during the constitution-making process. The Constituent Assembly that failed in the end was not a Constituent Assembly that had unlimited powers. It was designed not on the basis of the theory of constituent power. But some members of the Assembly, of the Constituent Assembly, declared that they didn't care about those rules because they had the sovereignty power. They have sovereignty, so they didn't need to obey this. So, for example, they threatened to lower the majority requirements to approve the norms. Just to give you an example, they did not succeed with this. They did not get away with it. But the fact that they used the narrative heightened the stakes of the process and lowered the incentives for cross-party collaboration in a very high way, I would say. So it was a theory that, even though it didn't prevail, still harmed the process.
You wrote, according to the constituent power theory, the Constitution can be legal or illegal, as its decision-making procedure does not need to follow pre-established institutional norms. When is a constitution illegal?
The constituent power theory says exactly that legality is irrelevant. Procedures do not need to be legal.
Right.
The Constituent Assembly in France did not need to follow the rules of the ancient regime. And the procedure that happened in Philadelphia to establish the new constitution in the US did not need to follow the Articles of the Confederation, right?
Yeah, and it did not.
And it did not, right? So the question is not whether a process is legal or illegal, but whether the law is relevant at all. And the constituent power theory says that it's not relevant. So, and it is important to make the distinction because the constituent power theory is technically compatible with respecting legality. And it's also technically compatible with not respecting legality. What matters is that the people decided to follow legality or not to follow the legality.
Yeah.
And I claim that this idea produces an instability that tends to harm constitution-making processes in the real life. The fact that you need to establish procedures in order for politicians to come to the table and bargain and achieve compromises and identify consensus. And if you don't have a sense of legality or of legal continuity, at least at a minimum level, then the process may fail at all. So the constituent power theory cannot explain why, for example, the interim constitution in South Africa, which was key to understanding the success of the constitution-making process that happened in South Africa, constrained the Constituent Congress afterwards, and why the Constitutional Court in South Africa used the interim constitution to check, review the constitutional proposal passed by the Constituent Congress.
We got to break that down a little bit. You're saying that there was an interim constitution between the old regime, which was the apartheid regime, and the African National Congress. Yeah. So the African National Congress created the interim constitution. Is that correct?
Yes. So it was a very long process. They couldn't agree on how to move forward. The heirs of the apartheid regime, of course, feared that as they were not going to have the majority in the future, their rights were not going to be respected. So why would they agree to, do a constitution making process in the first place? So they needed guarantees, right? And they cared about things such as property rights also. And on the other side, it was important to establish a majoritarian democracy that could provide an advanced, a transformative agenda that could give social rights and equality to the people that were not receiving it.
Right.
So the constitution-making process was the result of a compromise between these two views.
I see.
And the compromise, so the question is how to make that compromise credible.
Yeah.
So they set up a constitution-making process after a deal that they achieved after roundtable negotiations in a document that they call the interim constitution. It's like the constitution for making a constitution.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The interim constitution was supposed to be temporary. It was only setting up the rules for the process.
Right.
But it was not establishing a permanent constitutional order. The interim constitution was key because the interim constitution did not only establish the process, but also establishes substantive principles that were securing that South Africa was going to have a multi-party democracy, but was also going to be respectful with specific rights that each side of the table cared about.
It put limits on what the Constitutional Convention would be able to do, I guess.
Exactly. And it set up a court to check on those.
In the United States, and I've talked to George Van Cleve about this, he wants to create a National Convention Coordinating Committee. And this committee would set up the rules on how a constitutional convention would be organized. Right. And they would be very open. In his view, he thinks there should not be any limits on the convention itself, but only perhaps on how the convention is organized, how the elections for the delegates take place and that sort of thing, how the money is raised, that sort of thing. Thomas Paine, Jefferson, nobody left a plan as to how to make a constitution, even though they were saying we ought to have a new constitution every generation.
Yeah.
If that's the case, and still nobody left a blueprint for how to create this constitution, constitutions are revolutionary documents. So how is it possible to put any type of limits or to create any type of procedural outlines for creating a constitution? If the power is going to reside with the people, how can you constrain them in any way and tell them this is how people are going to have to create their constitution in 100 years? That seems...
Yeah.
I think you're suggesting that it would be better to have an established procedure for them to do that rather than let them try to figure it out every time. Am I right about that?
I think there's an important distinction to be made here that is at the core of the debates about revolutions. And by the way, the idea of revolutions can be approached by the idea of constituent power, but they don't need to. So let me give you a couple of examples. So think of Japan after the Second World War, General MacArthur, and the committee he placed to set up the Constitution of Japan, right, with some little acquiescence from Japanese authorities. And they set up a parliamentary democracy with that constitution. Then take Germany, for example, the constitution imposed by the Allied powers after the Second World War, right? So none of these constitutions was really created by the people, but, the circumstances were really serious. The point here is that you need to distinguish situations in which you are setting up a new political system, right? Because you have a broken system before, or because you did not have a system in the first place, right? You're either fighting the ancient regime in France, or you are fighting the Nazi regime in Germany, right? So you need to set up a completely new thing. And then you have other types of systems and different contexts in which you have a functioning competitive democracy. There you have political parties, right? You have flaws in the system. You have problems of corruption. You have many problems about liberties. So think of flawed democracies, right? With political parties in crisis. This is the case of Chile. This is the case of the US. This is the case of Iceland, I would say, with the constitution-making process they have.
Yeah.
And I do believe that these two types of situations warrant different solutions.
I see.
When you have the first type of situation, there's a huge political crisis, you need to set up a new political regime, there are more arguments to have a revolutionary narrative, right? Because you need to dismantle the old institutions and establish new institutions.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a functioning democracy, flawed but functioning, you have political parties, you have political competition, you have presidents rotating in power, you cannot predict the results of the election. Like, for example, in Venezuela, you can predict who is going to win the elections, but in the US, you cannot predict who is going to win the elections. So there is political competition, right? And you have things that work and you have things that do not work.
Mm-hmm.
And when you open the gates of the constituent power theory in a country that is of the second type, a flawed democracy that still has political competition, you open a Pandora's box because you are allowing whoever dominates the convention to replace whatever they want, right? So imagine, for example, that there is an institution that you think that is working reasonably well. Let's say, I would argue that in Chile, for example, that was the case of the judicial branch. The judicial branch is truly independent, it's adjudicated case impartially, it has many problems, but it's not a democratic problem, it's not a problem that you will solve by changing the constitution. But by opening the gates of the constituent power theory for the organ to revise the constitution, you are allowing that organ to solve and to change anything that it wants, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here the question of whether other mechanisms to approach how to make these changes that are more targeted, that deliver more deeper deliberations on the process. Think that constitutions are omnibus bills that are kind of unpredictable, because once you have a constituent organ discussing the content of the new constitution, they can put whatever they want inside. They can take things that were not constitutional and put them in the constitution and elevate their status, right? So they can put their own political platforms out there. It happens very frequently in Latin America. A new government comes in Bolivia, right? And that government didn't like the constitution of the previous predecessor. Think of the interim president of Bolivia, thinking of her. One of the first things she offered was, we need to replace this constitution because we cannot govern with it. This constitution was created by our adversaries, right?
Yeah.
You do not need to open this Pandora's box, and that's my claim, in competitive democracies that are still flawed. It is better to set up processes that do not use the constituent power theory, that are more targeted, that go to the problems that you are identifying.
There have been thousands of proposed amendments to the Constitution, but only a handful of them have been ratified.
Yes.
Over 200 years. So not much has changed in our Constitution over the lifetime of our Constitution. It's very difficult to change.
I cannot disagree with that. So many people think that the American Constitution is the most rigid constitution in the world, right? Because it's very old. It hasn't been amended many times. It has many, many problems. The Senate has a huge malapportionment issue.
Yeah.
The amendment rule should be amended.
Yeah.
And so on. But it's also one of the most flexible constitutions in the world, because it's a constitution that has allowed different regimes to survive under its framework. It's a constitution that has allowed different interpretations of it that have actually engaged in constitutional changes, not at the textual level, right? But you cannot say that the constitution that exists today is the same constitution that existed during the 19th century. So the constitution has levels of flexibility that have explained, I think, its endurance. And it's important to identify those things. And there are changes that can be made to the so-called super statutes, for example. These are statutes that are so important substantively that they acquire a constitutional status de facto, not according to legal theory, but de facto. And the jurisprudence of the courts can also help to update the text. The problem of the current constitution in the US, I would say, is connects to many specific things. So why not target those things particularly? There are huge problems with the Supreme Court. Why not target those problems? Why open the Pandora's box?
And let's say, for example, you wanted to eliminate lifetime tenures on the Supreme Court, or you wanted to expand the court, or you wanted to get rid of the Electoral College.
Yes.
How are you going to do that without a constitutional amendment or actual new constitutional convention? And in the United States, in my view, inequality is becoming a huge problem. I can go down the list. There's quite a long list of problems in the United States right now. It's terrible. And yet, you know, the United States is considered the oldest continuous democracy on the planet. I suppose we are the strongest, as I've said before, but we're not the greatest. We're ranked, I think, number 26 on the Global Democracy Index. We have a lot of things that we can improve, but we can't even deal with gun regulation in this country because the political system established by our Constitution is essentially pretty undemocratic.
Yes.
You write, citizens and their representatives need to face the hardships of polarization of current times, even in societies that are homogeneous, to build on a common political project with large degrees of spontaneous and free support. In those conditions, asking different parts of the society to participate in discussions about a new constitution, contemporary constitutions might be omnibus bills. Constitutions are typically created during times of turmoil. How do you create a unified political decision in that kind of environment? That's not easy.
No, it is not easy. And that's precisely because we need to widen the sources of legitimacy. Right? So we cannot put all our trust in the current generation because we don't have political processes that are credible, reliable today also. So this is a very important question. I'm not an American lawyer, so I cannot tell you precisely what things will require a textual change and therefore the use of Article 5 amendment.
Yeah.
But I can tell you the following. I think that procedures to change the constitutions when you have a competitive democracy in place, even though they are flawed, need to have solutions that are deemed legitimate by the public at large, not by a sector of the public, not by a simple majority, but by the public at large.
Supermajority.
Yeah. And also a consensus-based mechanism that can secure that politicians that are aspiring to compete for power in the future, rival politicians, will control themselves, right? You will want to set up a system that will, and this is not my idea, this is, if you read Donald Horowitz's last book, for example, he claims that something that is very persuasive to me. First, you need to find consensus. Consensus means identifying common areas, right? You need to have politicians, we all agree on dignity. We all agree on having elections. We all agree, and then you identify the consensus. Probably you need to have a larger conversation about how to identify the consensus. Probably you will need to isolate those politicians so they don't speak only to their external audiences, but they are genuinely speaking to themselves. Then, when you do not find consensus, you need to identify compromises. Compromises are non-ideal solutions that rival politicians can agree on. Compromises are very important because typically compromises are the best way to secure that liberal institutions will exist in the future. By liberal institutions, I mean institutions that will limit the power of those that rule in the future. You are more likely, and the evidence I think here is very overwhelming, you are more likely to have judicial independence in the future if you have electoral uncertainty and rival politicians negotiating the design of courts. Why? Because you don't know whether you're going to be in a position of power in the future. Therefore, you want to secure yourself a quota of your political rights. Tom Ginsburg, who you interviewed in some sessions ago, calls this the insurance theory. The same logic could be applicable to electoral mechanisms that secure a share for the minority of the future. The same could be said for public prosecutors and so on. So compromises are very important. And we need to set up procedures that secure that compromises are going to happen. When politicians have more incentives to veto each other, to block each other, to enter into gridlock, then we have a problem. So we need to identify ways for asking them to collaborate and to identify those compromises. The third stage is actually voting and using majority, which I would advise less for constitution making process if you are thinking of a constitution that should last for a long time. If you don't think that, if you think that constitution should last for a very short time, and you're basically agreeing that every time there's a new regime in place, there should be a new constitution, then you will disagree with my defense of this Horowitz model that I'm suggesting. And then the question is how to achieve those things, right? Consensus, compromises, and then majority rule on non-essential things that can make democracy work in the long run. And there are different ways, and the techniques are all need to be considered in pragmatic ways. For example, if you look at the Philadelphia Convention, right, and you take a look at Madison's notes, Madison says that, because we were working under closed doors, we could say things that otherwise we could not say. We could change our opinions because we could be persuaded, right? You cannot change your opinion if your audience is looking at you and scrutinizing you.
Right.
So the secrecy of the deliberations worked. If you want to have a citizens' assembly, for example, not politicians, but citizens, ordinary citizens that are not going to be running for elections in the future, securing the secrecy of the deliberations can also be useful for protecting them against those that are threatening them for any reason. And there are many ways to do this. I like the Irish model, actually. I think the Irish model of having citizens' assemblies elected by sortition after an agenda put together by compromises made by the parliament and having a referendum after the process ends is a good enough solution to reconcile the need to have social acceptance, to have the public coming there to agree on the solutions, and also having the logics of political competition within the process, because you need that logic to secure, again, liberal institutions in the future. So I like those kind of pragmatic solutions.
Is that a procedure that you think could be applied in the United States?
So I cannot answer the legal question of that because I'm not an American lawyer and I'm not sure which exact things require a textual amendment following Amendment 5.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that I think that looking at the US from abroad as a non-American and seeing that the US still has a competitive democracy, it is very important not to open a Pandora's box with the constituent power theory. So whatever system is being used, that system should be first being designed to target the problems of the US. And you need a shared diagnosis of what the problems are. And second, you need a procedure that can incentivize collaboration and not establishing and not vetoing each other. I think the Irish model is very interesting. Perhaps an adapted version of the Irish model could work. But again, the US has other problems because it's a federal state, and there's also an argument of sovereignty coming from the political communities of the states that want to be different from the majority. So probably I do not see a solution now. Okay. But I'm telling you that the criteria should consider these things that I'm telling you. Inclusive procedures that can incentivize collaboration, putting an agenda of considering long-term politics and not short-term political wins, and also do not open the Pandora's box that will give more danger to the process and can actually destabilize the process and even end up with a constitution imposed by a simple majority against a relevant minority. And that constitution won't last, I would say, for long. You want to create a constitution that can unify, not a constitution that can divide.
Right. On page 24, you say of your paper, is the constituent power theory a fertile ground for populist and authoritarian political narratives, right?
Yeah.
Hannah Arendt accused the constituent power theory of possessing arbitrary, unstable, and unconstrained dimensions that could encourage permanent revolutions and repeated challenges to the constitutional order. So,
Yeah.
Do you see the rise of populism as a threat to constitutional democracy?
I do. I do think that populism is a very important threat to constitutional democracy today. And I think the constituent power theory can be used as an argument to justify a populist uprising.
Yeah.
But the problems of populism are not only connected to the problems of the constituent power theory, of course. They are also connected to the problems of the political party system. And of how, even to social media today, how many people feel that they do not need representatives, they don't need mediators, right?
Yeah.
Political parties are very, very important, not only because they simplify the process, but also because they lower the costs for democracy to work in the first place. They help to provide a forum for representation. They help to signal the adversaries what are their ideological platforms. They lower the information cost of the voters so that they know what the agendas of the representatives are and will be in the future, right? So political parties cannot be replaced by direct democracy mechanisms. Political parties cannot be replaced by referendums, for example.
Right.
Referendums have problems because they usually present only a yes or no. They will always present a yes or no answer, right? Whoever holds the power of agenda setting and to when to put the question out there and how to frame the question will hold the power. So referendums are preferred by populists actually because of this, right? They can elude and circumvent parties, and so we need to be very careful about how to design referendums.
We don't have a national referendum in the United States. They do have it in Ireland.
But the referendum operates at the end, right? So after the consensual mechanisms have operated, after the deliberation has happened. So voters vote in the referendum to confirm a deal that was already made. And it serves a purpose not only of confirming something, but of checking politicians to make them accountable, right? So politicians will have more incentives to align with the median voter because they need, to get their things passed. But if you use the referendum, take the Brexit, for example, for an unspecified deal, before the political process takes place, before the deliberation happens, before sorting out all the details, then referendums such as the Brexit will help you not to veto whatever politicians are doing, but on the contrary, to empower them in ways that are not going to be accountable in the end. So they are going to substitute representatives instead of checking on representatives. So the way we design referendums matter a lot. And all of this constitutional is very common for populists that are pursuing a constituent agenda to open the constitution-making processes with referendums. And when I claim that the referendum should take place at the end of the process, not at the beginning.
We have a fairly broken political party here in the United States these days. The Republican Party has essentially collapsed. I'm not quite sure if it's going to be able to resurrect itself. It may not be able to do that. I'm not sure where the leadership is going to come from in the next several years. So we're left with one party in America. I mean, the Republican Party is still functioning, and it has a constituency, but it's fairly small. I think, especially when you look at the base of the Republican Party. What are we going to do if the political parties in the United States cannot function and our democracy goes into a free fall? What I feel like it's close to that now. I really don't have a lot of optimism for the future of our political system. I guess that's probably pretty obvious to most of the people who have been listening to the podcast. I really feel like we need to dramatically modernize our political system here in the United States. We need to update it. We don't have any, for example, we don't have any social rights in our Constitution. Our institutions aren't working that well. How are we going to get out of this mess?
I wish I had the answer to that question.
I wish you did too. That's why I was really hoping you could tell me.
I can tell you that whoever gives you an easy answer to that question is probably lying. Yeah, and it's probably a populist, right? Telling you that has a magic bullet to solve the issue.
Yeah.
So you should be skeptical of those that are offering solutions.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that the way, so political parties are in crisis not only in the US, but everywhere. Every modern contemporary democratic regime is having not the same problems as the US, but the political parties as representative institutions overall are having problems today. This is a world trend.
Yeah.
And I think that it is very important to examine how electoral regimes are shaping political parties. And there are electoral regimes that work, I would say, better than others in trying to align the parties more with the median voter and not to try to radicalize the parties to their more extreme audiences. So you have ranked choice type of electoral regimes that I think work very well. You have other alternatives to the primary system and caucus system that parties use in the US. And you should get rid of the electoral college in the way it works today.
Oh, yeah. These are things that I talked with back in season 1, episode 4 with Arend Lijphart. Wonderful. He was very clear about that. Yeah, the electoral college, he said the Senate, at a minimum, the Senate should have less power. The primary system, money in politics, all this stuff. So how do you change it? How are we going to improve our political system and make it more democratic by some act of the people as a whole, as George Washington said? I mean, if it's sacredly obligatory until replaced by an act of the people as a whole, we're missing a part here. We're missing something.
Yeah. I am a big fan of parliamentary regimes. I understand that it's probably unfeasible to establish a parliamentary regime in the US, even though people like Bruce Ackerman have strongly advocated for establishing something close to the German system. And I tend to agree with those proposals.
Yeah, I think so too.
But within presidential regimes, and the problems that presidential regimes have cannot be completely, I think, corrected, but they can be reduced and somehow controlled. The best version of presidentialism is collaborative presidentialism. Presidentialism where presidents have incentives to build large coalitions. And you need to establish tools for that. And there are examples of countries that have temporarily achieved that. But presidentialism has, I would say, a factor that destabilizes it with the way the presidential elections are not connected with the parliamentary elections. You would want to advance a system where the incentives of legislators and presidents are aligned, but at the same time, coalitional politics are also well regarded. This is how politics work, right? And should work. And the problem of populism is that is bringing a very bad reputation to these old school solutions that are irreplaceable.
On page 52 of your paper, The Problems of Romanticized Constitutions, the idea that the people are the ultimate source of legitimacy in establishing a constitution assumes that a unified political community can freely enact a constitution.
Yeah.
What do you mean by romanticized constitutions? Isn't the goal of any democracy to understand how to freely enact a constitution? Shouldn't that be the norm?
So I am making a point about history. So when we advance the constituent power theory, people tend to see the people, the idea of the people, as having a stable will that is unified and that can be assessed. This is in tension with the idea of having heterogeneous societies in the first place, consensus and compromises and so on. But the problem that those that are advocating this idea of the people have regarding the way constitutions are actually made in real life is that they tend to romanticize the founding. They build a myth around the founding, right? So the US Constitution was not drafted only by white men that owned slaves and that had land, but was in fact enacted by we the people, right? It is a myth. I argue that this myth in itself is a problem. It is a problem because when you build history around myths like this, you are overlooking important lessons that history brings, particularly of those minorities that were excluded during the founding. One of the reasons why I do not like originalism is because originalism is expert in creating these types of myths in the end. It's unavoidable, right? What we need to have is an historically informed view. And be aware that the founding was actually problematic. This happens not only in the US, but in every country. Why the Germans, for example, need to acknowledge that their constitution was not enacted by the German citizens? Because it is a reminder that they had a Nazi regime before, and they lost the Second World War, and the Allied powers brought democracy to them, right? So it is important to remind that. And every country will have their own history. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. And there is a lot to be lost if you do not do that. An example that I put in the paper that I think is very interesting is the way Brazilians have achieved another myth, which they call the mixed race that Brazilians have. They do not see issues of race based on the color of the people. They assume that there's only one Brazilian identity. The constitution is more modern, so this is not necessarily a constitutional problem attached to the text, but it is a constitutional problem attached to the way courts understand discrimination, affirmative action, and equality overall in Brazil. Because if you have this myth that the Brazilian nation was built on this unifying factor that is actually not true, then you will have problems in accommodating these minorities, in building affirmative action problems for them, and so on. And you could see, and American historians have also pointed some of these problems in the US as well. So I'm arguing against the myth. I am in favor of a realistic approach to the founding moments that we can learn from and be aware of those. And I don't think that having this will delegitimize institutions, as the proponents of the constituent power theory claim.
This is our history. We have a constitution that was basically created by a group of aristocratic gentlemen who thought that they could come up with a system that would be good for everybody, or I should say, I think they really thought they were coming up with a system that would be good for a minority of people, the property owners, really. I suppose that they allowed for the idea that maybe this constitution would be revised or changed or replaced at some point. But clearly they wanted to consolidate power and keep the country together and protect themselves from the various threats that were around them.
Yes.
I'm feeling very much the same way these days, that we are facing a lot of serious threats. Climate change would be the first one I would probably mention, and then you have inequality. That's one that is becoming more of a threat internally here in the United States. Education, housing, I could go down the list. It's a long list of things. Gun control. If the political system fails to address these threats, again, how are we going to get out of this problem if the power doesn't rest with the people to create a new constitution?
So one of the temptations that politicians in unstable countries have is to offer solutions based on the idea that the constitution should be reformed or replaced to address the issues that the country is experiencing at that moment, say housing, healthcare, whatever the people care at that moment, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to solve these problems directly by changing a constitution. So it's very important to understand what a constitution should do to help solving these problems. Constitutions should set a responsive and democratic political system where there are people that are accountable to us and also capable of providing solutions. This is different from actually having the Constitution solving the problems directly, right? Mm-hmm. If you try to use the Constitution to set up a healthcare system, for example, you will probably end up with a Constitution that will have a lot of democratic problems in the long run.
I see, yeah.
But the temptation of politicians using the constitutional moments of their own countries to, put their own political platforms out there. This is controversial in academia. Okay, there's no academic consensus on this. Okay. But there is a big question about what constitutions should have, and the constituent power theory does not allow us to distinguish which types of content should constitutions have. And I would argue that the content is only should be, from a normative perspective, related to the ideas that I told you before about having a responsive political institutions and so on. So if the American Constitution is not providing for that, because I think it is not, there is a good argument, for a good constitutional argument for the Constitution. But the Constitution should not try to solve the problem of global warming, for example, directly, right? Because it will be a poor solution. It will distract voters from actually those who can have the tools to do it. Mm-hmm. It will engage in years of a different discussion by approaching the wrong means to solve it. A constitution making process will typically will last long, right? The South African one lasted for 6 years. The Chilean one started in 2019 and is still there. It hasn't ended. Mm-hmm. So you should use the constitutions to establish responsive political institutions and let those political institutions to solve these other issues. Mm-hmm. And if there's a politician telling you that we're going to solve directly the problem of global warming or housing just by putting a couple of clauses in the Constitution, then that politician is probably either deceiving you or in bad faith or being, and I'm sorry about the strong word, but being ignorant about what a constitution can actually deliver effectively. Constitutions are just poor tools to engage with those problems.
Yeah, poor tools indeed. It is becoming obvious to many that we need some better tools to deal with our problems, but how do we get them? Tune in next time for a conversation with Samuel Aaron Moyne, the Henry R. Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at Yale Law School and Professor of History at Yale University. We'll discuss his recent New York Times op-ed entitled, "The Constitution Should Not Be Reclaimed." And I'll ask him, is it time for America to reclaim itself from constitutionalism? Until then, and wherever you are, stay safe out there.